just started watermarking every single word.
Claude's Watermark.
The European Union agrees, and that's why they just introduced the AI Act. They plan to do marking of all AI-generated content across all platforms.
Claude
is now watermarking everything it writes. Here's how it works. So imagine this. You write a 1,200 word piece or client. Every single word is yours. And then you hand it over to Claude and say, look, translate this into whatever language they're using. Let's say it's German. Well, that German page, the translated one, now carries a watermark, which is essentially just a signal that can tell people or whoever's verifying it that Claude at least involved in this. So in this video, I want to do 4 things. Firstly, I want to talk about why Anthropic is doing this. I want to talk about who it affects. I want to talk about when this is going to come into effect and how you can avoid it if it's an issue for your work. So let's talk about the first one. How can a watermark possibly live inside of plain English with nothing added? And that's really a big question here that took a long time for me to understand, and I'm going to walk you through the entire mechanism slowly, because once you see it, everything else in this video makes sense. So why is Anthropic doing this? Well, number one, it's the law. The EU Act has an article, which is specifically it's Article 50 in paragraph 2, that says that if you make an AI system that generates content, you have to make sure the content is marked in a machine-readable format. And that requirement turns on August 2nd. The fines, if you don't, those can go up to $15 million or 3% of your annual run rate, depending on which is higher. So I want to emphasize, this is not just an Anthropic thing. There's over 190 other companies that have signed this. I'm talking Microsoft, Google, Mistral, and on, and obviously Anthropic. And here's where it gets specific. The code itself says that text is different. An image has millions of tokens, right? You can hide a mark here in a few thousand and nobody will notice. Text obviously doesn't care to say metadata. So this watermarking feature only applies to texts that are longer than 200 tokens, which comes out to about 150 words. So in other words, let's say a LinkedIn post probably won't carry that or isn't required to carry that watermark. This script, for example, that I wrote for this video, this is 30 times over that watermark limit. So that's for text itself, and we'll talk about how it actually functions later on in the video. Now, from a detection perspective, detection has to be free. However, there is a rule that says that you can make it to only verify expert users. We're talking regulators, media, fact checkers, researchers, etc. Now, this might change in the future, but for now, there doesn't seem to be any plans as a free checker for the general public. And another thing that's important to keep in mind is part of the signatures that these companies have done is they've agreed that anybody who signs cannot promote or advertise tools whose purpose it is to get around these watermarks. So let's say there's another AI model whose entire job is to remove the original watermark. These major corporations cannot advertise or push those products at all. And we're almost done with the foundation layer. I'm simply trying to build an image of what the current state is. There's one more thing I want to add, which is not every single piece that touches AI will get this watermark. For example, if you are simply doing standard editing, so small edits that don't really involve generating new content, they give examples like grammar corrections, spelling, minor polishing that do not change the substance of the text itself. Those are exempt from having this watermark. Now, interestingly enough, Anthropic doesn't place a distinction between these two. Now, the reason for that is a mechanism that lives in Claude's word choices. It physically cannot tell whether the words choosing are an essay that were written from scratch or a translation of your essay. Let's talk about regions for a sec. I was thinking when I first read this is, oh, well, this is a EU thing, so it doesn't really matter for other people. The simple answer comes from Anthropic themselves, and I quote, they said, we're applying watermarking globally at launch because we don't yet have a durable way to scope it by region. Now, a user asked a follow-up question, which was, why not just check it at the region that was created at? And the reply from Anthropic was, at the time of generation, Anthropic can't know where the output will end up, which if you think about it, doesn't make sense. You could generate a document in one place and then paste it into a Google Doc in another place. It will be the same document. And California's own AI Act actually lands the same day, August 2nd, but that covers audio, video, and images, not text. One thing I did find surprising that I didn't know before going into this is that Google's Gemini app has been doing the same thing since 2024. It's actually the foundation is something called Synth ID, and it's the same sort of family of techniques. It's just nobody made a big deal out of it until now. OpenAI also uses Google's system for images, and they're saying that text is a goal for them to get to. Next thing I want to talk about is who is affected and when. The simple answer is that this will go into effect for everywhere that Claude lives. That's the API, the app, Claude Code, Cowork, Amazon Bedrock, Google Cloud, etc. And it travels. If you ask Claude for summary and you pay that summary into a slide, the slide goes into a deck, the deck goes to a client, the watermark remains because the watermark exists within the word themselves. As far as timing goes, any model launched from Anthropic after August 2nd will have this watermarking feature. page. And the deadline for any previous model is actually December 2nd, 2026. Now, Anthropic did say that they're going to be releasing this for older models in the next coming months. And as of recording, the most recent model launch was Opus 5, which was on July 24th, which is before the deadline. So today, no shipping Claude model is confirmed to have this watermarking feature. We still don't have any visibility into the model by model status. It might be on, it might not be, and nobody outside of Anthropic can really tell us. Same thing with the detection tool. Anthropic says that it'll come soon, which means right now, nobody outside of Anthropic can check whether a code has been AI generated or not. Now, I do want to be careful here because there's a version of this video that says that Claude is watermarking your text right now. That's not what the sources say at all. What the sources are saying is that this is coming in the future very soon. It's on every service, and the deadline for the old models is December. That's all we know for sure. Who's affected? Everybody who uses Claude for text, but affected how depends entirely on what the mark actually says, and it says a lot less than a lot of people think. The main thing that this watermark checks is what is the likelihood that this was partially written by Claude. It can't answer who used Claude. It can't answer what organization you're from, whether the claims are true or not, or whether some other AI wrote it. And I'll talk about why, by the way, for that last point here in a sec. Anthropic also did mention that it doesn't say anything about ownership, authorship, and doesn't mention the user's rights. It doesn't change anything about that. Now the part that I've been wanting to get to for this entire video, which is how does this actually work? And it starts off by understanding how Claude and these LLMs in general. Let's start with one fact about how Claude writes, because the whole thing hinges on it. Claude doesn't know the next word. Every single generation of word, it has, let's call it like a short list with odds. Let's say, for example, the sentence is, the weather today was cold and ... The next word is probably not going to be sugar, but it might be overcast, gray, wet. Let's put some numbers on those just for as an example. Let's say overcast is 45%, gray is 40%, wet is 10%, and then everything else is about 5% or lower. Both of those top two are fine. And Claude picks based on chance. Now, while it could always pick the best version, in this case overcast, that would strip so much of what makes it sound human. Now, the randomness introduces human-like writing to it. That's why. And this randomness is actually a dial you can turn. That dial is called temperature. If you make the temperature 0, it'll basically always be the best. And if you make the temperature, the more you turn it, the more creative or the more likely it is to use other words rather than the top word. Now, I bring this up because it's where the watermarking feature comes into play. Every place where 2 or 3 or more words will be perfectly fine is a place where a pattern could hide. Think of it like this. The difference in meaning between overcast and gray is pretty negligible. If you had a list of favorite words that the system was steered towards over a long enough text, you could probably determine the likelihood that this specific text was written by AI. Let's imagine it a little further. So imagine gray was a favorite word and you generated the sentence above 10 times. You'd expect gray to only show up about 4 times because the likelihood of it, if you remember, was 40%. But what if you generated it and it always came out gray? Well, you would believe, because of the fact that if you have to choose between these 2 words, you should pick gray. The likelihood that this was a favorite word is actually pretty high. That's the entire basis of how this watermarking system works. Whoever controls how the dice lands can essentially leave a signature without changing what it says. Anthropic has an analogy on this, and I think it's the best one I've ever seen. Imagine you're playing Monopoly. Normally, you're going to roll a die, and it'll be between 1 and 6. Imagine instead of that, you had the digits of pi. So to everybody at the table, it would look like dice, right? It's random numbers. There's not really any pattern to it. As far as they can tell, everything about this game is the same. But somebody who knows the digits of pi, somebody who has a book in front of them, they will be able to look at the moves. They will see 3, then 1, then 4, then 1, then 5, then 9. That's pi. And they will be able to tell this is not a random sequence. This is actually pi. That die is Claude's random pick between good words. The book of pi is a secret number that only Anthropic holds, and the moves are the words end up on the page. It's the same writing, the same odds, but the tie breaks between overcast and gray. Now follow a pattern that only the person holding the book would be able to know. And to wrap up the Monopoly analogy, if I'm a player, whether we're rolling dice or we're playing pi or we're using the digits of pi, as a player, is the same experience. It's just a bunch of random numbers, and the only person who would be able to tell that this game is actually following a specific sequence is somebody who has that list of numbers. Now that picture already predicts 2 things that we're going to keep coming back to. Number 1 is if there's only one possible next word, then watermarking doesn't really come into effect. For example, the sentence 2 + 2 equals can really only end with 4. There was no other alternative wording. In that case, the die doesn't really matter. Number 2 is if you're running an open source model on your own machine, you're the one at the table. You can use whatever die you want or none at all. There is no book. So in that case, it wouldn't be really a watermarking feature. And I guess the third thing that is the least important is pi is public, right? Just to clarify, anybody can look it up. Anthropic's key is not public at all. That's the security behind the system. And the other place where this analogy sort of breaks down is Anthropic's version isn't literally reading digits off a page. The way that the number is created and decided is what you call a ternate. And that's what I'll talk about right now. So a tournament, in one breath, is the following. For every word that Claude outputs, there is what's called a tournament. The players are the possible next words. Let's say, for example, we had the sentence, the weather today was cold and. Now, our players from Claude's own odds before any watermarking comes into play is overcast, let's say at 45%, gray at 40, wet at 10, everything else at 5 or below. Now, those 4 words aren't players. The tournament actually has 8 slots, and you fill them in by drawing from Claude's own odds. So let's say 8 separate times. So a word can be drawn more than once. So for example, overcast, because it has a 45% chance, comes in at about 4 out of the 8 slots. Gray gets 3, wet gets 1, everything else doesn't even make it on the tournament. So now you have something that looks like this. Overcast, gray, gray, overcast, wet, overcast, gray, overcast. Now, you might be wondering, well, why specifically 8? The reason why the number has to be even or has to be a power of 2 is every knockout cuts the entire board in half. 8 becomes 4, 4 becomes 2, and it has to be power of 2. Or the rounds simply don't work. Now, 8 is the smallest number that makes it easy to follow, but in the real world, for example, Google, they run 30 rounds or 30 slots, which is a much bigger bracket, and we'll come back to why that matters here in a sec. Now, there's an important piece here that's important to remember, which is nowhere here has any bias come into play. These odds were words that were going to be fine regardless. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been generated by Claude. So I want to emphasize that whoever ends up winning this tournament would have been fine regardless. Now, here's where the watermark comes into play. Everything up until now has been set up. Each round, everywhere in the bracket is worked in one of 2 ways. Either it's favored or it's unfavored. And favored beats unfavored. That's the only rule in the entire tournament. So where does the marking come from based on that? Well, it's actually a calculation. It runs at every single generation of word. It takes 2 things. Number 1, Anthropic's secret key, which is a single long random number they generated once and then they just kept it themselves. It never changes and has nothing to do with you, your count, or what you asked for. Number 2 is the last 4 words already ready. In our case, those 4 words are today was cold and. If you feed those 2 into a calculation and you hand it any word, it hands back on 2 answers. Now, the part that took me a minute to understand is the calculation isn't judging the word. It doesn't necessarily have an opinion. It doesn't think that gray is worse than overcast. It doesn't think anything, actually. It's a scrambler. There's no reason that gray comes back unfavored after cold and. There was never going to be one. Because if there were a reason, you could work out the reason yourself, and then you could work out the answers without the key, and the entire watermark kind of becomes worthless. It has to be meaningless. Everybody who doesn't have the number. So what it is, instead of meaningful, is it's repeatable. And here's how. The same key with the same 4 words will always get the same answer every single time. Whether you ask it today or you ask it in 3 years. That's the entire reason anybody can check a document later. They're not looking up. They're rerunning the calculation. All 4 overcast entries get the same answer. And every round gets a fresh marking. Being favored in round 1 tells you nothing about round 2. Now we know that some words will be favored, some words won't be favored. The question comes, well, does this make Claude's writing worse? That was my first question. And the answer is it won't. The reason for that is if you ask Claude the same question twice, you may get slightly less variety between answers across the 2 answers that you would have before. But in practice, people have not noticed a difference in the quality of writing. According to Google, they had a product approximately 20 million watermarked and unwatermarked responses, and the difference was less than 0.1% between thumbs ups and thumbs downs. And on Claude's side, or on Anthropic's side, a side-by-side of 3,000 explain like I'm 5 answer apparently had no significant difference on any of the 5 quality dimensions. So how does anybody detect this? Well, at each word, it rebuilds the calculation, the key, like we said earlier, plus the 4 words in front, and it asks one question. Was this word favored? And it averages. It doesn't need Claude, it doesn't need the prompt, it doesn't need to rerun anything. The paper says detection works without the underlying LLM. Let's look at it from this perspective. If this was text that was not written by Claude, the chance of the words that you were looking at being generated by LLM, by Claude, would have been about 50% based on the favored versus unfavored. Same if you had the wrong key. However, if you had Claude's key, every word on the page, most of them would be favored words. What that means is those words would show up more frequently, far more than you would expect. And this is, by the way, the reason why the shorter outputs are difficult to watermark, because there's simply not enough statistical evidence to point to one direction or another. The longer the words are, the higher likelihood to know whether something was written or generated or processed by Claude. I'll give you an example where it's going to work. Let's say, like we said earlier, 2 + 2 equals will always be 4. Isaac Newton's most famous work was called Principia Mathematica. That's always going to be the answer. There is no other answer apart from Mathematica at the end. One thing I found really interesting is this also applies to code. Claude or Anthropic also mentioned this, which is watermarking is much less effective or much less prominent with Claude Code, just because code is one of those things where there is usually only one next right token. Now, this doesn't stop it from watermarking watermarking comments. But the code itself is much less useful to watermark it because there is really usually only one right next token. And if you take anything away from this section, now that we have a better understanding of how the watermarking feature works, this is very different from tools that are detection tools like GPT-0, Turnitin, Pangram, stuff like that. Those tools look at patterns within the text itself to notice or to identify the writing styles of a specific model. So for example, you might notice that Claude models tend to use words like it's not X, it's Y, or they'll use the word quietly a lot. Those are just patterns that seem recognizable. The watermark is almost like a serial number. It's actually stamped at the factory and you can read it again at the register. And watermark is also just a probability. It is not a for sure. Now, obviously the higher probability, the more confident you can be, but it is a probabilistic essentially tell of whether or not this generation was done by Claude. Now the big question is, well, how do I avoid it? Let's say that I'm using Claude a lot and obviously I don't want my stuff to pass through detectors. It's important to remember that there is nothing in the text to strict. There is no tool to test against for now. And avoiding the mark means knowing which of your workflow leaves Claude choices in the final text, because that's really where the difference is. If you manipulate text afterwards a lot, then you can get away from it. And once you understand that term and thing that I spoke about earlier, this should make sense. Anthropic also said that light editing probably won't remove it. A complete rewrite will obviously remove, because all of the words have been rewritten by you. One idea that did come to mind is to essentially use two different models to rephrase each other. So let's say that you're running, now I don't know how long this will work or this will even really work, but if you took something from Claude and then you paste it into GPT, because they have two different keys, Claude's detector wouldn't be able to know that this GPT written version is from Claude, because technically it's not. But obviously as GPT releases its own keys, that kind of undermines that work. So if making sure that you don't get detected is a really important piece of how you work, then to me the only logical solution is to run a local model where you get to control everything. There is no keys, there is no watermarking. You would take whatever output you get from Claude and just either tell it to rephrase or paraphrase or change the writing to get the same meaning, and that will remove any watermarking. Now I know that was a long one, but hopefully by now you have a better understanding of the watermarking feature behind Claude. To re-emphasize or to summarize, the mark actually lives in the choices where Claude chose. It can be found by Anthropic with the key given enough words. Where you chose or where there's only one right word, it can't tell whether it was generated by Claude or by yourself. Now there are three things that I would watch. First of all, the detection API when it ships. December 2 is when the older models have to comply, and whether OpenAI's goal of being able to watermark text also launches soon. Thanks so much for watching. If you have any more questions on how the watermarking feature works, please let me know. Otherwise, subscribe for the next video. And if you want to learn more about AI, me and my business partner Mark run one of the biggest AI communities on School with over 1,400 members, learning AI and making money with it, and we'd love to have you in there.